Welcome to today's webinar in the Knowledge Miles series, part of the Lord Mayor's lectures on behalf of Alderman Professor Michael Mainelli, whose theme for his mayoral year is Connect to Prosper. In this free online lecture series, we address the connections in and around the square mile, what Michael likes to call the world's coffee house, and how these might help us to tackle future global challenges. I'm Professor Tim Connell, Chairman of the Gresham Society and a Fellow of Gresham College here in the City of London, and I'll be convening this session and moderating the questions and answers after today's lectures. So this is the plan for today. So a quick introduction from me, then the keynote presentation from Ruth and Andrew, and then we have round about 20 minutes for questions. Today we have a really interesting topic, from Fintech to Ubiquitech, a recipe to catapult the UK into the digital age. Now let me introduce the speakers for today's lectures. We are delighted to have with us Dr. Ruth von Hoofer, who has many years' experience of finance and technology. She's the lead writer for the recent report entitled From Fintech to Ubiquitech, Accelerating the Wider Digital UK Economy. This follows on, of course, from the Khalifa Review of 2021. Ruth, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about yourself.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and hello to everybody online. Just briefly on my background, I spent around 23 years in the financial services industry, across banking, across regulation, working in Brussels and negotiating things like the payment legislation, which opened up the market for fintech developments, but also in global transaction banking. And more recently, in the last few years, really focusing a lot on technology change and how that's impacting the financial market infrastructures and all business models we see around us developing, particularly as we now sort of entering the age of data and AI. And I'm currently a non-exec professor on the board of a stock exchange, a bank and a fintech, as well as a visiting professor at what used to be called Cass Business School. It's very nice to be with you here today.
Excellent. And also today we have Andrew Churchill, an expert on information security and cybercrime, and also a contributor to the report. So Andrew, what can you tell us about yourself?
Hi, my name's Andrew Churchill. I'm originally a government defence analyst, then moved on to lead the original Home Office Cybercrime Task Force and coordinated Whitehall's cybersecurity and defence requirements for a number of years, setting up what is now called Innovate UK. I'm the author of the British Standard in Digital Identification and Strong Customer Authentication, and digital identity comes up an awful lot here. And I am a consultant and advisor to British Government, EU, DHS in the States, FinCEN, etc.
Splendid. So now, what can you tell us about From Fintech to Ubiquitech, and why is it a recipe to catapult the UK into the digital age?
Okay, let's start. So if we move to the next slide, please. I thought it would be helpful to lay out briefly the rationale for even starting this report. Unlike what you will see with many reviews done in the market, it tends to be mandated by government or certain parts of the industry. But this was really something I've been brooding over for the last few years, particularly, I would say 5-6 years ago. The issues were around digital payments, then the start of open banking, opening up the markets and moving everybody in the UK into digital payment methods. But this has quickly been taken over by what we would call now the data economy. We're no longer in a nicely siloed financial services world where we just control our entities, regulate them, and control our systems. But really, every business is now dealing with data. Data is becoming the new key asset class, or the oil of the economy, as many called it for several years. And we even see it called out in many government bills and legislations and narratives in general, that smart data, the smart data economy that we're currently building, is going to be based upon the open banking infrastructure, which of course we've been building up the last few years. Now, this move into the data economy and even the move in the past into digital payments as a start really necessitates for the UK to become a digital economy, a connected economy, an economy that is using infrastructure, access, skills, security, data highways and standards in such a way that it can truly lift up to that next level and actually make use of the data economy opportunities that are out there. And this was really then the motivation to write this report with a group of excellent experts across different aspects of the report pillars, which we will go on in a minute. And this is really how we started running workshops last year. Everything was done pro bono by ourselves, and we're now at a point we're starting to see that all of this is starting to really accelerate in the market. It was very well received by the City of London and the Lord Mayor, who actually gave his own foreword to it, which is also the reason why we're now here with you in this exciting lecture. So let's move to the next slide, please. And over to Andrew.
Sorry, really ought to be used to this. Amateur error, I forgot to unmute myself again. During the course of the review, we have had a number of legislations coming through, and during 2023, a number had received royal assent. So we have the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act up first. This contains some crucial aspects into reforms of Companies House. Many of you will know the Companies House does not currently do any form of sanity checking on the quality of the data. But also on the economic crime side, there is a new failure to prevent offence coming through, which is going to be revolutionary in preventing organised crime from dominating the current systems and the vulnerabilities within. We also had the Online Safety Act coming through, looking at providing telecommunications companies, social media, to actually have a duty of care reinforced, particularly in prevention of crime. And then this often seems to be come across as being a strange one, the Electronic Trade Documents Act. This is actually vitally important because 80% of global trade is written under English common law. And this is a crucial area where now, up from the 22nd of September, electronic trade documents have equal legal standing to the traditional paper bills of lading. And then we have the Financial Services and Markets Act, which for the first time clarifies that crypto or virtual asset classes need to have the same consumer protections as those which have traditionally been managed under fiat. But the most important and the crucial one is the one bill to rule them all, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill that is currently at committee stage in the House of Lords. Has all of the four acts are absolutely, totally, 100% reliant upon how we handle data. And all of that data handling is due to be covered under the DPDI. And that is currently in scope. So currently the House of Lords, as I say, committee stage. What we need to see, and as the report says in some depth, clarifications that when DPDI says there is a recognised legitimate interest to share data and intelligence, then it is signposting to that failure to prevent. It is signposting to that IDV of new directors. It is signposting to the duty of care which telecommunications and social media companies have. And indeed, it signposts to the reliable system required under Electronic Trade Documents Act, because otherwise we have a brand new asset class that could be really, really badly exploited by organised crime. Next slide, please. So, moving on to the UK's USPs at the moment. The first and foremost, it is this enabling legislation. We have, as I said, 80% of global trade written under English common law. Therefore, the UK has a unique position to take this further forward. UK has also seen the success of OBIE over the last 6 years now to stimulate the UK fintech market. And as the secondary line of the report says, it is from fintech to Ubiquitech. This is from Khalifa to Vonturfa. Open banking has been seen to be a huge success in the UK. We are moving into open finance and smart data. DPDI explicitly says that all smart data systems will build on open banking, and that is an absolute USP because the UK is seen as leading the world in the adoption of these technologies. Ruth, do you want to take the last two?
Yes, so as Andrew said, the common law piece is, of course, a key pillar because 80% of global trade contracts are actually agreed under common law and also disputed in London under that legislation. And we're also the global financial and insurance center, just in more general terms. And I think kind of reflecting back on what we've achieved with fintech and with open banking standardization, we're really now at the cusp of saying, we could be incredibly influential as the United Kingdom to support a global standards creation around a reliable data system that is actually accompanying global trade documentation, where we can truly certify and monitor from the source to the table where certain materials, raw materials, and trade supply chain value chains are coming from. And this is, of course, a much broader undertaking. So by, first of all, creating a regulatory status for digital trade documentation, we've taken the first step. But the next step is to think about identification of assets in the global supply chain, such as expansion of the existing legal entity identifier infrastructure when it comes to organizations, but also to think about how we use, for example, spatial data from satellites to identify where, for example, a certain supply chain originates from, where this might come from a provider that is actually involved in deforestation and therefore would create a true issue in terms of ESG reporting and the ambition to be a net zero economy and facilitating businesses to obviously purchase supplies across the world with the assurance of where these come from. So we are at the very early stages of thinking about how we can then build on the digital trade documentation piece from a regulatory perspective to actually get involved in global common data standards and an infrastructure creation that could take us to the next step. And I think that is a very important broader dimension, which sort of builds on the UK itself as an economy becoming digital. But as we laid out at the beginning, the enabling legislation is there, and that tends to be the basis based on which you can build these things. And that's why this report is very timely in terms of now creating the opportunities for businesses, standards, and testing and sandboxes to take place going forward. Next slide, please. So let's look at the recommendations. What we really try to aim at is condense those down to 5 key pillars, because there's nothing worse than having very long reports that you can't really do anything practical with. Now, I started my conversation here with identifying that we've really moved from early stages of digitization of certain products, such as payments, into an actual data economy, which is global, which has no borders. And we as a country need to make sure that we are taking the best out of that, but we're also protecting ourselves. And the best and most important piece here is, of course, cybersecurity and fraud controls. We've seen in the financial services sector that fraud has been exponentially increasing. We are aware that any new technology gets straight away exploited by fraudsters and organized crime. And therefore, cybersecurity needs to have a very different angle around starting from early stage threat intelligence to forward-looking cybersecurity approaches. This is not about saying, oh, I got hacked, I have to report a data breach, or I might have to pay a ransomware. This is about using data that is out there in the informal and the formal economy to actually create a much better forward-looking identification of cyber risks. When we talk about fraud controls, of course, this hangs off straight away in the financial services area. And we've seen that from anecdotal evidence, the majority of retail payments fraud, for example, with authorized push payments, which have been rising significantly in the UK over the last few years, that these tend to originate from social media platforms for the majority. And of course, that suddenly brings you into a different context when you think about the regulated industry. This is no longer something that the financial services industry can fight alone, even if we establish now, by virtue of having these new bills and acts in place, a much more effective data sharing and financial intelligence sharing approach. But this is actually necessitating non-financial institutions such as social media platforms to be part of this and to also have their duty being performed around intelligence sharing to fight this fraud together. The second piece, and this is what I really see as the bottom of the pyramid here for any digital economy, is of course network. You need a resilient, available network that is able to perform at speed. If we think about the many years of discussing leveling up in this country, how can we actually ensure that everybody can be as productive as possible if there are some regions in this country that still don't have fast broadband or very bad or no mobile network coverage. This, of course, now has a slightly additional dimension as we're moving into net zero considerations, which is, of course, one of the UN sustainability goals here in terms of having sustainable networks. So how do we not only make sure that we create complete network coverage in this country, where we've seen large country examples like India having achieved this already this year, but how do we do this going forward in a sustainable way? And we have a number of recommendations in that space. Networks and availability and the right systems and processes around it, of course, are also a key ingredient to enabling the population at large to engage in the digital economy, to engage in digital payments, particularly as we think forward a few years maybe, where we might see a digital pound sterling in our mobile wallets. How can you make sure that everybody has the opportunity to use these new tools if you don't have ubiquitous network? And that's really where the term ubiquitous and Ubiquitech comes into its own in that context. Digital systems and trade, I just alluded to the fact that based on the initial digitization and legalization of digital documentation in trade finance, we are now looking to create that reliable system, which will need to be in place in order to have a real data flow that accompanies physical supply chains from origin to recipient. And that has to be done both in a sustainable way, in a way where assets, organizations, and individuals are identified in a very resilient way, but also when it comes to the asset that we add more and more data variables that we can maybe capture from space and other areas in terms of the imagery in order to create this real ability to then report on it later on. Today, we don't have global reporting standards for ESG from an environmental perspective, but by creating the system and creating the necessary data points, we can actually then create reporting standards on the back of that. Verification and authentication of users, entities, and assets is therefore closely linked. If we go back closer to home, the point here is that every individual that wants to participate in the digital economy needs a digital identity and ability to verify and authenticate themselves, and to do it in a secure way, not in a way that is easy to hack, easy to manipulate, and of course, therefore, to create fraud and digital identity theft. And clearly, this is something where everybody seems to be very comfortable having a Google or Meta identity, but we haven't gotten to the point where we have a sustainable individual identity concept, particularly as we're moving into open banking to open finance and smart data. We will need to think about digital wallets that will be able to collect different identity credentials for an individual. We will need to think about consent dashboards where every individual can see which consent they've been given to which authority to have certain parts of their data for certain purposes. If we think about open banking moving into smart data, I want to be able to share maybe parts of my healthcare data with a particular university research project, but not necessarily with Meta or Google or maybe my insurance company. So this has to become a much more user-centric approach. And this could be delivered with forms of self-sovereign identity. But if we think, for example, about the European identity wallet approach, this could be something we could think about here as well, because it's really about empowering the individual and the business to engage in a secure way with the digital economy. This is not about big brothers watching you. This is about you as an individual being in control of your different identity verification assets that you have. And the last one, which is incredibly necessary for all of this to work, similar to the network availability in point 2, is of course having the right digital skills to engage with the digital economy. Therefore, education and inclusion are incredibly important pillars, and this has to run through from school education up to how different businesses educate their customers, not only banks. Clearly, regulators can only play a catalyst role to get different parts of industry engaged in education. But again, here we would also look to businesses like social media and data companies to play a role as opposed to just the financial services industry. Over to you. Next slide, please. Andrew, you want to start on that? Oh, it's disappeared. Okay. So let me quickly explain. Do you want to, Andrew, are you still there? I think it's your turn.
My fault. I switched my camera off as opposed to unmuting myself. So on the since we published on the 21st of March, there have been three very dramatic reports coming through on next steps. So first off, I referenced these are all in the last week. So at the Innovate Finance Global Summit last week, we had the publication of CFIT. Ruth will move on to CFIT piece in a second. Oh, sorry, Ruth did JROC. So the CFIT Open Finance Task Force was set up. So Bim Afolomi, the Economy Secretary at the Treasury, announced the launch of the task force, which has been handed to Innovate Finance to take forward with CFIT. So that's good news. There is concrete action coming forward, but also the Department for Business and Trade published their smart data roadmap. Now this is crucial, and unfortunately it's quite hard to see on the slides unless you're on full screen. But this was published this month and is the government's roadmap for how smart data will build on the DPDI bill when it gets royal assent. And this is from 2024 to 2025. This is from a governmental perspective, this is an incredibly fast rollout. And the roadmap talks through which sectors are moving forward fastest. So smart energy is one of the first off the blocks, then they're moving to smart transport, and then healthcare and other sectors come into play thereafter. Open finance is already underway, so the task force, which CFIT are now leading, is already up and running. It had its first workshop at the Innovate Finance Summit last week. That's already in play. We had already had an open finance policy sprint back in 2022, looking at the building blocks for how pensions, insurance, etc., could move on to open banking. DPDI builds all smart data onto open banking, and the open finance aspects are already coming to the pass. Energy, transport, healthcare, agri-tech, clean tech, whatever tech you want to put in place. This is why we call it a Ubiquitech Report, because it's all the underpinning technologies that are needed, and the hundreds of flowers that have bloomed in the fintech revolution that London has seen and is taking advantage of should turn into thousands of flowers that we can take advantage of in the UK, given the other technology aspects which can be built upon it. If you want to move on to the JROC piece.
Yeah. And then the last one is the Joint Regulatory Oversight Committee, which is FCA, PSR, Treasury, in terms of taking open banking further. We've seen, of course, the open banking implementation entity years ago built on the CMA 9 order to implement the first standards for open banking, but this is now moved to Open Banking Limited, and now we're discussing the future entity. And what is remarkable about this report is the absolute recognition, very much in line with our Ubiquitech report, that this is no longer just about payments or finance. This is about the whole economy. And this is about really thinking, how do we make sure that open banking application programming interfaces as an infrastructure with those particular data libraries that still have to be created for other parts of the economy are actually going to be executed going forward. This entity will therefore have a very multidisciplinary approach. It is an early stage thought piece moving into that future entity, but we will start to see that there will have to be almost like a standards body that will take care of all the data highways across all the parts of the economy, so that we can truly move from open banking to smart data covering every part of the industry in our country. And that is the remarkable recognition here. How this is going to happen is touched upon in a consultation, but I think there will be various iterations, because this will require not only an alignment of regulators and the right ministries from a governmental perspective, but also part of the actual industry, whether we talk about healthcare and NHS or educative sector, universities. This has to do with everybody being there to play their part in this broader context. Next slide, please.
And to build on the DBT report on the roadmap, DBT are Department of Business and Trade, just give the full acronym, are the key body behind the Smart Data Challenge. The Smart Data Challenge is led by DBT themselves, the Smart Data Council, and the Open Data Institute, all of which are essentially DBT funded. So the crucial part here is that the department, alongside the roadmap, is sponsoring a challenge. So as it happens, I presented at the final pitch on the day of Ubiquitech's publication, purely coincidentally. So we are now looking at the next steps for the department to support both the requirements for DPDI going forward, but also the investment round that was announced by Kevin Hollenrake in the margins of that report and the challenge itself of government funding to support new use cases, looking into how that smart data can build on open banking. And that is hopefully going to be coming through in the course of the summer to actually get the UK further forward and with research funding into new use cases. Ruth, I'll hand over to you for the COL side.
Yes. Now, of course, here we're talking on a lecture of the current Lord Mayor, Michael Marnelli, the 695th Lord Mayor of the lovely City of London. And of course, this is very close to the heart of the City of London Corporation. He has a very, very big initiative of Connect to Prosper across different parts of the industry. And one of the key 6 streams is, of course, the smart economy networks, to which the Ubiquitech report nicely fits into, which is why Michael had kindly done the forward of the report. And we're actually working with him under the Smart Economy Network to take forward our recommendations into a next step approach to think about sandboxing. For example, when we think about the digital identity verification piece and the global trade finance digitization piece. He recently gave a speech on this, where the other key pillar drawn out was, of course, ISO 20022. For anyone who's very familiar with this, is a global standard that has been used in the payment space, and that really has a very, very large data set to identify many attributes of something traveling, something of value, and therefore moving into ISO global standards is a key ingredient to create interoperability. And if we think about global trade finance and trade documentation, there is a key role for ISO 20022 to be played and to be implemented as well.
And on the last bullet point here,
yeah.
one of the beauties of all this is it's building on the Ubiquitech report. All of this is coming together into a cohesive, dovetailed approach. So Ruth and I are both going to be at the Smart Economy Network tomorrow morning. Alongside the anti-fraud aspects of this, we have HMRC and International Chambers of Commerce also joining us as part and parcel of the reliable system. The reliable system, the benefits under Electronic Trade Documents Act are estimated to be 224 billion, that's with a B, to the UK alone. That's roughly 10% of GDP. As you can imagine, that becomes an attractive target for organised crime to exploit, and therefore the reliable system is working with the anti-fraud standards, with the Smart Economy Network, with all of the other legal changes, to make sure that we actually have a fully resilient and robust system underway, because we are creating brand new asset classes which are going to be of colossal value to UK PLC and the City of London in particular. And I think with that, if we move on to Q&A.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ruth. So some very interesting points there. So we have about 20 minutes now for questions. Sorry, Ruth, I interrupted you.
Yeah, I've just some closing thoughts. What is quite crucial in terms of the timing now is, of course, to make sure that the digital data protection and digital information bill, which is currently in its last phase of negotiation, is going to have a clarification within it, because it is the bill, as Andrew called out, that is the data bill. It's the data bill that links all the other bills together, because all the other bills we talked about, economic crime, corporate transparency, online safety, and all of those pieces all have data within them. But the governance of how you deal with data is, of course, determined in DPDI. And that is the last stage of making sure that this is clarified, because without this clarification, we will run into the risk that we're not going to make all parties accountable. Reference to social media and app scams, for example, and we will also not create the benefits of having a data economy that fully functions in terms of responsibilities and sharing. And doing the sharing also in such a way that we don't replicate data. We have a key principle in our report that states we should stop continuously creating new data sets of replicated data that we're exchanging, because that increases the risk of data hacks. Instead, we should find more intelligent ways of actually confirming certain data points, particularly in a privacy preserving way, for example, by using zero knowledge proof technologies, so that you confirm that certain identity has been compromised, or 5 banks have accounts for the same biometric credential of a person that is posing with different names. And those are the sort of practical things that are included in this report that are really valuable to be implemented in order to very quickly reduce the challenges of fraud and allow for a digital economy to strive.
Right, on to some questions. One from Dan Feeney here. When will the UK grasp the nettle around digital identity and perhaps move in a self-sovereign direction?
Well, thank you, Dan, for your question. This is the necessity, and I think the report makes it incredibly clear. If this is not dealt with by the industry and by the government in terms of encouraging it, we will not be able to actually have a valuable and secure participation of all of our individuals in the digital economy. So my personal vision is that a self-sovereign identity, where you have a wallet that you can control as an individual, is the right way forward. It would certainly also stop all the political conversations around big brothers watching you, because this has to do with you controlling the information. But what we need in the market is providers that provide you the wallet infrastructure, the consent dashboard. And if I just recall that the European legislators actually proposed in the payment services regulation that banks will have to offer, for example, a consent dashboard when it comes to payments and providing consent to share certain data aspects in order to initiate a payment. This is something that is going to happen by law in Europe. And here we should think about a consent dashboard from a technology perspective that allows you as an individual to administer various different identity attributes that are then ultimately validated by those issuing entities, whether that's your university, whether that's the government in terms of the passport you hold, or whether that is your driving license and the driving license authority. So this is what is being proposed. We already in the market have a number of different identity provisions, again, different businesses running different models. We see, for example, the Nordic Bank ID model, which is all about bank assured identity, so that I can, for example, from my bank vault, share certain data aspects with a third party to confirm my age, or to allow for a delivery of a good because the address is stored with my bank. This is an alternative model that also worked really well in the Nordics. So there are different models of assuring identity and allowing for digital identity to work. And we would expect, in the combination of the acts and the DPDI becoming an act, to see a lot more of those business provisions coming forward, because they are now being enabled by the legislative framework.
Right. Questions are coming in.
If I quickly pop in on that one as well. So, and afternoon, Dan. So, as you know, there are moves afoot towards an intelligence utility arrangement. So the DPDI should enable that. legally speaking, in particular in concert with ECCT and OSA. And as I have put it on a number of occasions in the past, this is the UK coming to a dreadnought moment, because no current government identity systems anywhere on earth are using actual security. They are relying on paper-based documentation. I could get a German passport in any name I like. It's very straightforward. The manipulation of the enrolment is currently an embarrassment globally. The UK will now be empowered to actually take a leap forward, that dreadfort moment, and actually come up with some secure identity systems.
Right. Now, on to a question from Alex Rocha. While we accelerate the wider UK digital economy, how do we go upstream so we can embed regeneration into value creation and away from our current value creation by consumption model?
Right, that's a bit cryptic, but I mean, I guess my first response is that this report has been written very much in light of sustainability. So creating new technology and infrastructure that is sustainable, that is built on different things, so to speak, and to have that as an ongoing theme for anything else we start innovating, so that the consumption of it doesn't create those negative implications. I think one other aspect to add also to the first conversation in terms of identity and identification and verification, we're also proposing to really leverage the increasing use of biometric credentials to actually enable and encourage both banks and other companies that deal with data and businesses and individuals to have a multimodal biometric approach, so that you can always randomly combine different biometric credentials for any authentication that is happening, which makes it a lot harder for a fraudster to impersonate different people along the chain, because you will have a combination of the location, the IP address, and fingerprints and facial and voice, and that makes it more complex and enables more security to be performed.
Right. A two-part question from Zoe Buckingham. What initiatives are needed from which organisations in order to move this all forward? And how do you anticipate the Ubiquitous network being funded?
So slide 7, the last slide, gives a short précis of the current work that's currently underway. From a funding perspective, the DBT roadmap references an initial funding pot. It was £750,000 for next stage research in this. Many of you will have seen the funding profile under the JROC piece, that at the moment OBL are looking, have gone out to the industry for a voluntary funding round to take things forward. I believe, from top of my memory, 2.25 million for this calendar year, and another 7 million for next year to take things forward. As you can imagine, given the scale and the size of the prize, that is piecemeal for industry, even within financial services, let alone the fact that the entire point of the Ubiquitech report really is that Fintech has been a huge success in the UK. Now try and expand that out into every other different sector. If we're looking at single-digit millions for next stage financial services, one can imagine that I did a paper for the Minister 2 years ago on why open banking cures cancer. One can imagine the NHS spends tens of millions a day on trying to find cures for cancer. One day's worth of that support could have an incredible impact on medical research. And Sir John Bell, at Oxford University, one of the team behind the vaccine, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, That was a cure, or sorry, a vaccine, sorry, for a brand new disease within 6 months. We've been studying cancer for 30, 40, 50 years, and this could enable the data to be managed in such a way that we could cure cancer this calendar year if we just get it right. Now, I'd be very surprised if AstraZeneca or another big pharma wasn't willing to put their hand in their pockets for a single digit millions of pounds just to get that part through.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo this, global
Yes.
supply chain is another example where corporations will need to be able to prove that they have purchased supplies that are sustainable and not, for example, subject to deforestation. This is becoming an ethical mandate as much as a regulatory mandate over time. So there is a need to have the data and to have the data to flow. So we need to set standards and create the data highway. And just reflecting back on the fraud figures that are exponentially increasing, by suggesting different ways of authentication and verification with technologies that are already in place, we are just there to do a small step financially to create a big gain in terms of mitigating the losses that are otherwise going to continue and create unsustainable businesses.
Oh, no. Sucretu Anil Bave is asking the agencies which control the digital networks and which have access to the data ought to be answerable to their clients. And these, we suppose, are the citizens of the world in general. So how much control by the clients over the agencies has been designed into the roadmap?
So this is the $64,000 question under DPDI. There are a number of ways in which this could come to pass. One of the fundamental underpinning requirements for Ubiquitech and indeed for open finance is the requirement for a consent dashboard. It's control of your data needs to be controlled by the owner of that data, and I'll clarify that part because it's in an Oxford versus Moss 1981 basis. You don't actually own your data, but you do have a right to control how it is used. However, the consent dashboard needs to be able to empower the consumer as an individual or a business or a consumer of data as a business needs to be empowered that they're taking the DPDI smart data building on open banking. If you think of it as a TPP on steroids, this trusted third party provider needs to be able to offer you the ability to decide what your data is used for. And that should be and must be under GDPR, or as we have it, DPA 18 as amended, and now DPDI as coming forward for 2024. Thou shalt have control over how your data is used. Now, this opens up the possibility of the long-held academic theory of the monetization of our own data. At the moment, Google, Meta make money out of our data themselves. We don't get a look at it. There is a potential model coming forward whereby we can then start monetizing our own data. The example I use on the open banking curing cancer perspective is I may say that I'm happy for my medical data, whether it's held from my GP, the local A&E, the hospital trust, those legacy systems using APIs, I can now have a medical dashboard. Now, I might be happy to tick a box saying I'm happy for Sir John Bell at Oxford to use my data for the cure for cancer. I may tick a second box saying I'm happy for Sir John Bell at Oxford and AstraZeneca to have access to my data for a cure for cancer. But I may also tick a third box saying I'm happy for Oxford and AstraZeneca to have access to my medical data, but only if AstraZeneca pay me 20 quid a month. Now that potentially has the power to reduce the financial and digital divide and actually get more people able to access the Ubiquitech and future systems.
That's a
Just
very interesting
to add,
point.
I
Yes.
mean, just a little point to add here, because we've seen this also from a European perspective, that you are no longer supposed to be forced to access Meta, Facebook, going forward using Meta or Facebook's credentials, but instead you should be able to access it with your European identity, electronic identity. So the Europeans have by law reversed it to give the user control and to remove the requirement of using credentials and access procedures of these big techs, so to speak. And this is exactly what we are thinking about here as well, to reverse it and to make sure that individuals can truly know who's using their data and be in control of how their data is going to be used, so that we can end up with this opportunity to monetize and also just to have a better control of your personal data.
Right. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but there's a question which I think is in everybody's mind. It comes from Tim Francis. Are the anti-fraud initiatives keeping up? The pace of change that you've outlined is a very fast one.
I have been doing work on deep fakes and the arms race on this basis for many years. In fact, 2.5 decades now. So we believe that the current I believe, and indeed I am rather hopeful that if we can coordinate the legislation and regulatory controls properly, I believe we are at a point of switching off the criminal threat. We are at a pinch point whereby the intelligence sharing arrangements which are laid out between OSA, ECCT and DPDI could frankly switch off fraud. So I am very confident that we are very well placed to make an absolute step change from the UK, within the UK, and then ideally for UK PLC, sell that model internationally, because we are very well respected in security systems. ISO 27000 family, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, is just the rebadged British standard. British Standards Institute are currently driving a digital toolkit of standards which includes anti-corruption measures. It includes identity measures. It includes obviously 27000. We are at a turning point, I believe, and the legislation we have coming through, that UK USP of having the legislation coming through at the right time, provided it all actually dovetails properly, and this is the crucial part about the clarifications under DPDI over the next month or so, I believe we are at a fundamental change.
I
And
think that's
just
a
to
very
add,
positive note. Yes, Ruth.
yeah, we need to implement it. I mean, just even thinking about the secure customer authentication and the global standards that we've been driving in this country, we have an industry, for example, in finance, which has only partially implemented it. So the report very clearly calls out what practical steps need to be taken now in order to actually avail of the benefits we have already created with standards and regulations, and to move to that next level, for example, with multimodal biometrics and other aspects. So we have to just get on with it.
Oh, well, on that very positive note, I'm afraid that's all the time we have left for questions. So let's just have a brief look now at some of the forthcoming lectures. Friday the 26th of April, we have Mastering Misinformation, How Stories, Statistics and Studies Exploit Our Biases and What We Can Do About It. Wednesday 1st of May, The Real High Flyers, Migrating with Birds and Other Animals and Why They Matter to the City of London, especially the pigeons, Our Supply Chains and Our Future. So that's a very interesting one. And Thursday, 2nd of May, Generations, Does When You're Born Shape Who You Are? Now that gives you plenty of variety, so do please keep tuning in. So now finally, let me say thank you to all of you, the audience, for your interest and for supporting the Lord Mayor's lectures. And of course, thank you to Dr. Ruth von Hoofer and Andrew Churchill. I see incidentally you're being sponsored by the Worshipful Company of World Traders, so thank you to the World Traders as well. I'm sure our Lord Mayor would want me to say that too. This lecture and all our lectures are recorded and posted on the Gresham Society website and also on our YouTube channel. in case you'd like to revisit anything, including the questions and answers. There were some very good questions coming in, I'm afraid. We just didn't have time to take them. But we do hope to see you again soon for another lecture in the Knowledge Mile series. And don't forget the Mayor's theme for the year, Connect to Prosper. Thank you and goodbye. And thank you, Andrew and Ruth, once again.
Thank you. Goodbye.